we go. So welcome everyone. Thanks for coming out this evening. We're really excited. This is the first time that we're offering an online workshop in photography techniques for artwork with Erik Pinkerton. We've been working with Erik for a number of years, so it's great to be offering this to the community. I don't know that I've met all of you in person, so I'll start with some introductions. I'm Garnet Muthing, and I'm the art curator with the Department of Tourism and Culture. So I oversee the government's visual art programs, which means taking care of their art collections and acquiring new work for the collections, which for the artists who are submitting artwork involves photography. And it's something that people find really challenging, which makes sense because it's very technical. And so in any way we can, we like to offer these workshops to help people develop skills to do their own photography when they need to. You would have corresponded with Heather Leduc, who is our project coordinator for registering for this workshop. So Heather is available tonight. She and I are going to be just doing support for Erik with this workshop. So if you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. And Erik Pinkerton is our facilitator for tonight. We've been working with Erik for many years, offering sessions for artists who are applying to the permanent art collection, where Erik photographs their work and they get professional photos for their applications and for other purposes. Erik is a professional photographer with years of experience doing portraits and events and all kinds of other photography. He has a wealth of knowledge, so I'm really excited for him to share that with you tonight. And what else can I say? Before we start the workshop proper, I'll acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of the Kwanlundun First Nation and the Ta'anquechan Council here in Whitehorse. And if you are on a different traditional territory, please feel free to acknowledge that in the chat if you would like to. So for the format of the workshop tonight, Heather distributed a PDF that Erik prepared, which reflects a lot of the material that he's going to be going through. So he'll start with some of the technical aspects of photography. During this time, if you have questions related to the things he's talking about, please put them into the chat and we'll relay them to Erik so that he can incorporate answers when he has a chance to. Afterward, we'll go into some practical examples where he'll be showing you approaches he took to photograph certain types of artwork. And at that time, please treat it like a really informal kind of Q&A session. So feel free to turn on your mic and ask questions if you have them about those pieces that he's showing. Anything else you'd like to add, Erik, before we get started?
No, I think that's everything. Thanks, Garnet.
Thank you.
So, hi, everyone. Well, I have a wealth of experience in photographing things. What I don't have is a lot of experience in Zoom-based workshops, especially not in the art world. So this will be my first time doing this exact workshop. So bear with me. I think it's going to be really interesting. It's a little bit unfortunate that we can't be in a room together doing everything hands-on. That really is the best way. That being said, what we found out in the in-person workshop is really there's so many different people in the Yukon doing so many different things that there's just such a wide diversity in the art in the Yukon that almost everyone in the room with us the other day was doing something completely different. And we probably could have spent an hour or two with each individual person talking about their needs. So we'll try to cover a lot. It's going to be a lot of information pretty quickly. Please let me know or let Garnet know in the chat if I'm going too fast for you and you're completely lost. I'm going to start off by saying the handout that you have, the idea behind it when I made it was so that afterwards you guys can go back and when you're actually trying to practically photograph your art, you can maybe look at it and use it as a resource. Maybe it will be a reminder of some of the topics we talked about. So just a heads up, I did not have the foresight to actually match up my speaking notes with the handout, and it'll be a bit of a scramble if you want to follow along. I believe all of the information more or less is in there, but it's not going to go in the same order. Yeah, and we're just gonna jump right into this. So I'm completely lost, Garnet. I'm having issues adjusting to sitting here with a laptop and not being able to move around the room and do this the way that I usually do. So we'll get there though. It's going to be good. Okay. So basically we'll start out, I guess the big question for everyone would be the type of work you're doing, if it's 2D or 3D work. When we're photographing submissions for the permanent collection submissions, I think I said submissions twice. We have essentially we have so many different, such a variety of work between 2D and 3D sculptures, jewelry, clothing, so on and so forth, that we actually do separate days for them because they're a completely different methodology. To photograph sculptures, you just go at it really differently than you do with 2D work. So I'm going to try to cover right now just the differences between them, I guess, and the things that you need to know about, because I'm quite certain there are people here who do paintings and there are others who do sculptures. Anyway, the biggest thing, probably the most important part to start with, is it's really important that you yourself know what you're taking the pictures for. So there are differences in how you're going to take these pictures based on, for example, if you're a painter and you're taking pictures of your paintings that you want to then reproduce and sell as prints, postcards, etc., or if you're taking pictures of your paintings to just show off your portfolio, or if you're taking pictures for an application for example, the permanent collection submission. Interestingly, when you're doing 2D, there's less of a difference. It doesn't matter nearly as much what you're taking them for, but the amount of detail you go into and the amount of effort you put into it might actually matter. I mean, you definitely, for a submission, for a gallery, for an exhibition or collection, you definitely want to be showing your best side and showing your work as best as possible. But you also have things like artist statements that go along with it. You have descriptions. You have a group of judges who understand art. So, you know, if the colors are a tiny bit off or something, it's not that big of a deal. If you're selling prints of your work that's hanging in a gallery, you're selling prints in that gallery, you want those prints to look exactly the same. If you're selling basically your work, prints on canvas, you want it to be the exact same. So then you're going to go into a lot more depth with the color management and try to get that all perfect. In the same regard, if you're just trying to sell your work via a website or something, instead of doing like a close-up picture of it where it's all perfect and exact, you might actually want to do something where you hang a piece of your art over a couch in your living room and take a picture of it that way, or in an office space or something, so that the person who's interested, potentially interested in buying it, could see what that would look like in an actual livable space, usable space. Then it's the same thing essentially with 3D photography or with 3D artworks. So your sculptures, your jewelry, and so on and so forth. You've got to ask yourself the same questions. Are you putting this stuff in an online gallery, in an online shop to sell as jewelry, for example, or are you applying for a collection or an exhibition? For one, you might want to, for example, if it's for an application, you'll probably just want to have a classic neutral background for your sculpture so that the people, the jury, the people who are going to be making the decision can see it very clearly, a clean picture. They know exactly what's going on and what to expect. You may want different multiple angles of the piece, whereas if you're selling jewelry, again, you might want to have a picture of it around, if it's a necklace, around someone's neck, for example, showing the practical usage. So that, I think that's a great place to start. It'll let you know essentially how strict you have to be with following these rules, how creative you can get with your photography. So 2D or paintings, I'm just going to defer to saying paintings because saying 2D bothers me. It could be any medium that's flat. That's a lot more prescriptive in how you're going to photograph it. And your ultimate goal is going to be getting the colors as exact as you possibly can and getting the highest quality of image that you possibly can so that you have a really clean, perfect reproduction. Yeah, I guess that would be the goal with that, is you're always aiming for that reproduction quality. Whereas 3D, you just get to show it however you think best shows off your work. And there's a couple different rules you would follow. For example, you want your piece to be the main subject of an image. So we had someone in our workshop on the weekend who photographs their jewelry on pieces of wood. It's really quite beautiful. Great way to do it. You wouldn't necessarily want that, you know, deep in the bush hanging off of a tree where it might go under. You really want to figure out how to bring that piece to the forefront. So as soon as someone looks at the picture, their eye is drawn immediately to your piece of work that you're showing off. Yeah, that was that. So just very quickly moving on. There's also a huge difference. We actually, unfortunately, didn't really get into this on the weekend. There's a huge difference between large format pieces and smaller format. In the world of sculptures, if you're doing a full size, sculpture that is going to go out on Main Street, think the statue in front of the federal building, you're going to want to photograph that obviously in a large space. But what you're going to do, you're going to be more concerned about the space than anything else, like the size of the space, the distance from the piece that you are able to stand. Whereas when we're talking about, or I guess to finish that off, if it's a small 3D piece, a piece of jewelry, I essentially, when I do product photography, I'll often just do it, on my kitchen table, because I'm setting up a little background there and I don't actually need a lot of space. My kids can be, coloring or eating breakfast or something at the same table, and I can still have my setup. It's not something that honestly happens a lot because there is still a lot of lighting, but if it's a small piece, you can really do that sort of anywhere. Why I started rambling about this, though, is that especially when it comes to 2D or paintings and so on, you can actually, if it's small enough, you can just as well scan your painting or your work. And often that's the best solution. So if you have something that's essentially, an 8.5 by 11, and you have access to a scanner, that's often going to be a quicker, better way to get a reproduction of your picture than if you have to photograph it because you have different things coming in. However, that's often not the case. And it also, in that scenario, has to be perfectly flat. Like if something's extremely textured in acrylic or an oil painting and there's a lot of thick ridges, then a scanner is not going to be your best friend anyway. But it's something worth thinking about, and I think it's something that people overlook a lot. We automatically go to photographing it, but for example, I mean, we've photographed illustrations for people. They could be just as well done on a scanner, a flatbed scanner, and then you don't have to go through all of the light setup and figuring that stuff out. Another issue is if you're doing very large paintings, there's also the possibility that you're going to be in a situation where you won't be able to get back far enough to capture the whole painting. I've had this issue with murals before, especially indoor murals. And then you definitely need photo editing software, a decent photo editing software, and a tripod, because you're going to have to take multiple pictures of that image and then stitch them together later to get your one product. And honestly, it's something that if you can avoid doing it, that's way better. But if you're in that situation, just know that there is a real possibility, if you're making very large format works, that they're possibly going to have to be photographed in chunks and puzzled together later digitally. That being said, I can actually touch on that right now. I might get back to it later, but if you're using a DSLR camera or a camera with essentially interchangeable lenses, you definitely don't want to use a wide angle lens. Even if you're in a situation you kind of feel like you have to, it can be tough. You have to make that decision if it's something doable or not, because the wider the angle of your lens, the more distorted your image is actually going to be. And you're going to have a harder time later making it look square and flat. Yeah, it's going to cause you a lot more trouble. So typically, for anyone who uses a DSLR camera or a camera with an interchangeable lens, something around a 50mm lens, maybe 35mm to 50mm is sort of the area where I would say you're good. You don't want to go any wider than that. If you have the space, though, feel free to go longer, like 80, 100mm, something like that. You're going to get a really nice look from that. basically it's the way that lenses distort and compress the perspectives. When you have something really wide, it's gonna change your lines. So think about pictures you may have seen, real estate pictures or something like that, where you can see that a wall has a bend in it, or a door frame has a bend in it, or a sink or something like that. It's because they used too wide of an angle. Whereas if you can move in just a little bit more, it's going to flatten everything out and straighten up your lines. That's especially important. So that aspect is a little bit less important if you're doing 3D work. But it's especially important when you're doing 2D work, that essentially you want your lines to be straight. You'll really notice it if you go to crop your photo later, and then you realize that all the sides don't line up in that perfect square. And a lot of the time that's because of lens distortion that came from too wide of an angle, or other reasons that we'll also get into quickly. So moving on, I'm just gonna check sort of where we're at in this handout and see if I'm anywhere close to where I want to be. You know what? And that's a good point. I will skip over to this.
Eric, well, while you're regrouping, I just wanted to ask, would you be okay if I put you on focus mode?
I don't know what that is, but
I think so that when you're speaking, you fill the screen.
Oh, okay, sure.
I just didn't want to do it without warning you.
Okay.
Okay, let's try it. Thank you.
I don't know what that means. I just know that you are just a name. Oh, there's Heather.
Oh,
okay. I can deal with that.
Now Heather's on focus mode.
Easier for me to talk to a face than text across the screen. So jumping back to the actual handout that you have.
There we go.
We'll get into the essentials and the gear. So where I basically like to start is that the best gear to do the job with is what you have, really. There's tons of different things. There's tons of stuff you can buy and invest in. And, there's setups that are more optimal and things that are a bit ridiculous and over the top. But in the end, whatever you have access to is the best thing that you could use. There's no reason. There's enough people doing this stuff with their smartphone. It's maybe not the ideal tool. It's not necessarily what I would use, but if it's what you have, it's better than not taking your picture at all. And really, it's possible to get these images with any technology and any gear. These are just like, you're going to have to work a little bit harder with the smartphone, but that's okay, because if it's what you have and it's what's in your budget and it's what's in your pocket, then it's perfect. So I'm just going to quickly go through my list of sort of essentials. Starting, you need some sort of camera. That's going to be your most important piece here. It doesn't matter, as I said, if it's a smartphone, a DSLR camera, a little point and shoot camera. The ideal situation is, an interchangeable lens DSLR camera, but then you get even further. If you don't have the correct lenses, does it make sense to... Anyway, you can essentially just keep buying and buying and buying until you have too much. So going back to it, I got lost for a second. Use whatever it is that you have. So yeah, brand of camera doesn't matter. What kind of smartphone you have doesn't matter. Essentially, all that matters is that it takes a picture. I maybe wouldn't recommend doing it on the old flip phones. You're going to have a pretty low quality picture, but it would still work. You would still get a picture. So the next thing I would say you definitely need, and I think that anyone who's doing art and wants to be selling their art, wants to be applying for exhibitions, collections, all that, it's worth the money to invest in a tripod. A tripod is super important for this type of work, and it's going to make your life so much easier. And on Amazon, you can get... I don't like Amazon, but it's easy. We're in the north. It's the easiest way to get things here, to be honest. But you can get tripods basically for between, $20 and $1,000. And in most scenarios, especially if you're using your smartphone, a $20, $30, $40 tripod is going to do the trick. What it really comes down to when you're talking about a tripod, I have one here. What the major differences are going to be is the stability and the functions in the head. So the different angles that you can tilt at and so on and so forth, how much weight it holds, how flexible it is, and how high it goes. So this tripod is my main workhorse that I use for every photo shoot, every type of work. And I've been using it for, it's got to be close to 15 years now. And I think you can buy these ones for something like $400. I'm not saying advocating for spending that much money for what you're doing, but the point is, in the grand scheme of things, it's not insanely expensive. Once you go sort of beyond this one or this sort of type, size, style, the biggest difference that you're going to get to is just the material the tripod's made out of, meaning the weight of the thing. And so essentially they start getting more expensive because they start getting lighter and still being stable. For something like this, you're going to have it in the corner of your studio or whatever space you work in, and probably fold it up, and you're not dragging it around the world with you. So it really doesn't matter. I do all of my photo shoots involve a lot of lighting, a lot of equipment. So I don't need to go and spend $1,500 on a super light tripod because it's going in my car anyway, right? So it's not a big issue. So that being said, the point is sort of anything below that like $500 range is perfectly fine. Anything above it gets, it's just technical and different features that you're not going to need for this. The one thing that I would note is if you're using a DSLR camera, they're heavier typically than obviously a cell phone. Like a cell phone's super light and you can use a pretty flimsy little tripod for it. But when you're using a bigger camera, they're quite heavy. And then depending on the lens you're using, sometimes that lens is really heavy and they'll be very, very front weighted. For something like that, I would recommend going a little bit in the higher price range and getting something that's a bit more stable. Typically, if you find a tripod on Amazon for less than $50, it's going to have real flimsy, wobbly aluminum legs. And as I said, for a cell phone, that's perfectly fine. But it's not the most stable thing in the world. There's one thing called a Gorilla Pod. If you look it up, those are these kind of cool, like flexible little tripods. And I think they're relatively cheap and they're quite stable. And you buy the one that's sort of suited to the camera that you're using, and you can wrap them around things, and like they're really easy to use. And I don't think those are too expensive. So any of those types of things are going to be great. When it comes down to it, you need your camera to be stable. So you can also put it on a table. You can also stack it up on books or do whatever you have to. With a DSLR camera or even a point and shoot camera, that's usually going to be fine because they have a flat bottom. With a cell phone, it's not, because it's not going to stand up freely. And if you use any of those like popper things or anything like that, even lean it on a wall, you know, it's going to be on an angle. And I'm trying to find my cell phone because I thought that was a point. Anyway, it's gone now. Oh no, here. Anyway, so this is going to be a huge thing, right? You're going to need your camera like this and not leaning like that. It's going to make a big difference in your image. And I guess I'll talk about that really quickly. If you go on to page 3 of the handout there, there's a little image that says avoid keystoning or image skew. So keystoning, or I guess image skew, it would be, as you can see here, on different angles, when your camera's at different angles to the piece that you're photographing, the lines are going to converge in different ways, and it's no longer going to be flat and square, basically. I realized before a really great example of this is this one. I have a whiteboard behind me. And so right now, it's pretty square, but I'm not in the picture. So if I want to be in the picture, I would go like this. But then you can see what happens to the whiteboard, right? As I move the angle of my camera, the angle of the whiteboard is changing, which is not ideal. I can't, if I want to get a print of my painting, I can't necessarily printed like that. And when I go to crop it, I'm going to be cutting off. Whoa, that was good. I'm going to be cutting off these lines here because they're on an angle. And so it'll go like we'll lose that part of the painting to try to get it into that square format or rectangle format. Yeah, so it's really important that your piece that you're photographing and your camera are completely parallel to each other. And when I say your camera, what I'm specifically talking about is the image sensor. So if you have I guess that one picture does really sum it up pretty well. But if you have a DSLR camera, you can, or a mirrorless camera, even something you can take the lens off of, you can change it, or you can see the sensor. But the sensor is what used to be the film, the 35mm negative, and now it's a little digital screen that basically captures the picture, right? And that's perfectly flat on the other side of your display. So if you look at the display on your camera, the sensor is directly behind that. And that's the piece that you want to be perfectly parallel with your painting. So as you see in that image, it's okay if my painting is like this, that's okay, but then I need my camera to be like this. Same thing, like those two axes have to be parallel. So it's just going to be a lot easier and save you a lot of trouble if you have your painting or whatever you're photographing and your camera perfectly flat on. It's a similar thing if you were taking a picture of a sculpture outside or a statue, something relatively large. You know, if you photographed it a little bit from below, it's going to actually look bigger than it really is, which might be what you want to show. It might not be. It's just something that's worth keeping in mind all the time. And for, as I said, for flat paintings and pictures, anything that's two-dimensional, it's super, super key that that's flat. So continuing on, we definitely, in our list of things we 100% need, we need a way to hold our art, right? And so this comes back again to what are you taking these pictures for? What are you using these pictures for? The easiest way to talk about it, I guess, is in terms of 2D artworks, because when it comes down to three-dimensional sculptures and so on, that's essentially just photography. I mean, you can take any photography skills and transfer that onto a three-dimensional piece. I mean, it's the same as photographing a person, right? If you have a sculpture standing here on the table, it's the same. You would do things the same as you would with a person. And we'll get into the nuances after. But so really, where you're putting your painting, sorry, that was the reason why I'm going to talk mostly about paintings. But that, oh, I lost it again. This computer thing's really killing me. So we want something to hold our painting, but we also know we want our painting to be exactly flat. So while you might think, for example, that leaving it on your easel is a good solution, it is and it isn't. There are a couple things that sort of work against us in that regard. First off, easels are typically not straight. Even if yours has a setting and it goes up and you feel like it's really straight, it's usually a little bit tilted. And we use them to photograph art as well, but it then involves sort of popping it up on the edges and straightening it and maybe jamming something in there so that the painting can't slip out. And sometimes, depending on the size of the painting, it also involves security hands on the sides, making sure if something does slip, that there's someone there to catch it. Like, it is a little bit precarious. So if you can, it's great to hang it on the wall. It's great to do any of that. But again, keep in mind that angle. So you don't want to hang your painting on a wire where it's going to come out. You want that to be perfectly flat. And honestly, probably the best way to do this, if you have the capability in that it's the piece is small enough, is to lay it out on a table or on the floor, flat. And then to use your camera, either you use your tripod, you have ideally a tripod that points directly down to the ground, which is less common, granted, and a little bit more expensive usually, but you can get tripods that will point right down to the ground. So you either have that, or there's a fun little function we found, at least in your iPhone. I think that the Android phones did it too, but If you're taking a picture of something on the ground with a phone, you can try it, or a piece of paper on the desk or something. You're going to get two little crosshairs in the middle, and there's going to be a white crosshair and a yellow one. And when those are lined up, your phone's perfectly flat. And so that's a great little trick. And you can use that to be able to photograph your painting on the floor, hold it from above without a tripod in this case, and get your phone completely flat. That being said, it's also, that function only works on your phone if you have the grids turned on, the little grid lines on the camera. If you don't, I highly recommend it. For every photography workshop I do where anyone's talking about how to take pictures with a smartphone, I recommend going into the camera settings and turning on this grid. And what it does is essentially splits your phone screen into the rule of thirds. So it's going to make your life easier when it comes to photographic composition as well. And it gives you these fun little features of like lining up your picture perfectly. So, oh, and to get into that too, obviously, if we're taking pictures of 3D pieces, we also need something to put our artwork on, right? But we're going to look at it a little bit differently, and we're going to think about this a little bit differently. Do we want a classic type, like gallery type of picture? You're going to probably want something black or white. We often use plinths to photograph 3D artworks. It's not necessarily something everyone has access to, but what you do have access to, most likely, I don't want to assume anything, but what you likely have access to is a dollar store and some sort of table, chair, something in your house that you can push up to a wall. And then you can buy a piece of Bristol board, really in whatever color you want, but the classic ones would be white and black, essentially. And you can tape that onto your wall, tape it onto the table, and then when you're shooting that, you can't really see, that's what a terrible view here, that's better. So then when you have your subject on the bottom part here, you have a nice, clean, continuous background without having a little crack in the back. What often, or what always happens if you just, you can take a white plinth and push it up against a white wall. You're always going to have a little crack in the back where the corner is. And so if you do this with a piece of Bristol board, then that will eliminate it and it'll be a nice smooth transition. The benefit to that too is depending on what you're photographing, you can get neon pink or green or blue or whatever you want. If it's something that's a nice contrast with your sculpture and that's how you want to show it and sell it, then that's awesome. And that's a great way to choose your background as well. I've done similar things where for photographing earrings, I believe, where I did exactly that with a piece of, I think, turquoise Bristol board, and then had some lichen that we found in the woods that was a color that nicely matched the sort of bridged the gap between the actual piece that I was photographing and the background I was using, and just sort of decorated it that way. And so it brought the piece to life a little bit without really going over the top, without going over budget, without taking forever and having to build something and paint something. So it can be really simple. There are a few things to think about when you're photographing on black. It will absorb light. So if you're in an already low light situation, it can definitely take away some of the lighting. When you're photographing on white, if you don't have quite enough light as well, you can also have issues with the white turning a little bit gray. Often you will fix those issues with your lighting or with your camera settings, if possible. And one little trick, if you're photographing with a cell phone, the focus is also attached to the exposure. So when you tap on your screen, you're going to want to tap on a spot that ideally on your, let's say, sculpture, you're getting a glare or something, or your jewelry that you're photographing, you're getting a glare coming off the light you're using. you're going to want to tap on the brightest part of that, and your phone will automatically reduce that to make sure that that one is exposed correctly. And that can also help you out with your background. If you're photographing on black, for example, what we found when we were doing this practically the other day was that, you know, trying to compensate for bringing in as much light as possible, when people would hold up their phone to the black background we were using, it would suddenly become sort of a light gray because the phone was overcompensating for all of that, and it was trying to brighten things up. And so we found it was really important to exactly sort of tell the phone and lock in exactly where you wanted, like where that brightest point was, and it darkens the whole picture up. So I have obviously lost myself again, because that's just how I like to do things. But we'll get back to it. Okay. I got it. See, I knew I could do this. So that brings me to the next point. The next thing that we absolutely need, the next essential to take pictures of our art, is light. Because photographs are just light. And photography literally means painting with light, or light painting. It's Greek. I don't speak Greek. It's something along those lines. You're using light. You're bouncing it off of things. That reflection is what you see. That's what your camera sees. So obviously we need light. That's not always the easiest, especially in the Yukon. But places to start. Light number one. Always light source number one is natural lighting. There's nothing that beats it. Natural sunlight, at least, well, okay, I say there's nothing that beats it. That's kind of a lie, but that's okay. I can live with that. When we're talking about paintings, when we're talking about two-dimensional art, natural light's the best thing you can have. To be honest, it's probably the best thing that you can have in a portrait as well, but you need to be able to mold it sometimes and shape it. Basically, when we're photographing two-dimensional pieces, we want the light to be as flat as humanly possible, because we don't want any shadows cast on it, right? We want corner to corner, every bit of that image to be the exact same brightness so that we can see exactly what's on it. And we don't want any glare. So the flatter that light is, the better. And luckily, natural light is often very flat. There are a few exceptions. So when I go and photograph a wedding, and it's one of those crazy Yukon bluebird days, and there's not a cloud in the sky, and these days it's probably 28 or 30 degrees, because that's apparently how we do summer here now. Inevitably, I get there and someone looks at me and says, "Oh, you're the photographer. Well, this is great lighting. You must be excited. This must be awesome. Great lighting." And I look up in the sky and I see the burning fireball of a sun that's just killing all of us, and think, it's kind of the worst situation you could possibly have. People don't seem to get that. So this is me telling you to start getting that. That's not good light. It's hard. It casts shadows. It makes things shiny. It's reflective. As I said before, what do we want? We want flat light that doesn't give anything definition, and it doesn't make things glare and reflect. So we want the exact opposite. The best light shaping device there is good cloud cover. Think about any day, essentially. I mean, I think enough of us probably work in office buildings in this place with very little windows to know, any day that you go from inside to outside in the winter with overcast cloud cover, you're still going to squint. You're often still going to be wearing sunglasses. It's often going to be too bright for you outside, even though it's gray and gross. And it's because that light is still there. It's just behind the clouds. But what the clouds are doing is diffusing it and spreading it everywhere, as opposed to having one central point, right? And that's why natural lighting is great. So if we're photographing in the summer, for example, I mean, if you're brave in the winter, depending on what you've painted, you can absolutely, if there's cloud cover, take your work outside and photograph it there. That's probably like 90% of the time for 2D works going to be your best bet. We talked about this before. I've talked to multiple artists about it. Garnet talked about this and said that she had it as well. In art school, people are taught to photograph their paintings outside on a cloudy day. That's it. Super easy. It's winter, like, I don't know, 13 months of the year here. So we might not want to go outside and photograph our painting. So luckily, we also have this wonderful other thing that is windows and doors, and they have an amazingly similar effect. So especially if you have a big glass door in your house or a big window, and this is good for everything. Like if I'm doing a portrait of someone in their living room and they've got big windows, then I'm putting them close to a big window, because the way that the light breaks, even if you have like a hard midday light, you don't necessarily want to put someone right in that, but the way that the light breaks coming through the glass, it's quite diffused and it's quite beautiful. And so we can always use that. So what I'll often do here is we do our art submission painting, our photographs in the library or in the Kwanlin Dunn Center, and I'll often set up my camera with my back to the window, and I'll set up the easel. I guess if you imagine you're standing at the window right now. No, that doesn't work. This is the window. I'll be standing with my back to it, and I'll set up the easel here so that this artwork is getting all that light from the window. And ideally, again, I'm on a tripod, and so I can set the timer on my camera and I can step away so I'm not casting a big shadow. And most of the time when we have paintings that are really difficult to deal with glare as well, especially, I photograph them like that. Another thing you can do if you don't have access to a big window like that is go and prop open your door. And this is a great experiment. I wish I could show you right now. If it wasn't dark outside, I would. We did this on the weekend and it was fantastic. It looked so dark and kind of gross outside. But then when we turned off the lights in the building, you could still see very clearly the shape, exactly where like the hot spots were, where the light was coming in through the door, through the window on the door. These were glass doors, luckily. And what you could see was there were some spots that were very neutral and there were other spots that were brighter. So basically you're just going to look at that and you're going to find that spot that's not directly in the light, but just a little bit beside it. And that's where you're going to put your painting and just lay it down on the floor and photograph it like that. Natural light is always going to be your best bet. But again, you don't want direct sunlight because that's going to be too hard. It's going to give you harsh shadows. It's not fantastic. So next, if you do have the luxury of having a flash, and this is where I should insert the point that the flash on your camera phone, on your smartphone, they're not called camera phones anymore. Did you know that? That was a thing a long time ago. Your flash on your smartphone and your built-in flash on your camera are not usable. They exist for the very, very few situations where it's more important to just have actual photographic evidence of something than it is to have something that looks like something you want to look at, I guess. Just right above your lens is a terrible, terrible, terrible place for a flash. It makes everything look flat and gross. It's just not a nice look. And I'm sure we all know it from point and shoot cameras from our childhood photo albums or whatever, or the moment that you go and take a picture and it's a little bit too dark and your phone's on auto flash and suddenly it flashes and you see it and think, oh my God, that's not what I'm looking at. So you never want to use that ever. If you do, however, have off-camera flash or off-camera lighting, if you have access to anything like that, what you're going to want to do, and keeping in mind, again, there's a lot more creativity involved with sculpture and 3D. So I'm talking right now more about two-dimensional things. You're going to want to create that flat light. You're going to want to have your lights at 45-degree angles to the painting. I think I have a picture of that in here in case anyone doesn't know exactly what I mean. I do. There's a little diagram. And the way that the light crosses then, it covers all parts, but without being too harshly in front of it. Usually that's the best starting point to also get a nice flat image. Although there are then issues where we get glare and you have to work around that. And I'll show you some pictures later of different setups. I think if I collected those pictures like I meant to. Anyway, we'll talk about it, of different setups and different things that you can do if you're still getting glare. But essentially that's going to be the starting point, is those 45 degrees. I use flashes because I have flashes, because I use them for other things. You can also use continuous light for this. The important thing though is, for example, one great thing are those clip-on desk lamps. If you get two of those, ideally once they're the exact same, and you can clip them on to something at 45-degree angles, that's going to be perfect, because you can sort of change the angle they're pointing at. You can set them really well. That's really great. But something to think about then, if you're using continuous light, is that you ideally want something that has a daylight type of color. So if you're using a light where you have a normal bulb that you can change, you want a daylight bulb in it. You don't want the ones that say that they're soft. I think, like, if you're at the hardware store and you're looking at light bulbs, there's this wide spectrum of different colored light that comes off of it. And we all know it. I think it's a really common thing for some reason in Yukon houses, often newly built ones, that every light switch seems to turn on a different color of light. And then when you have all those lights on, and some of them are like white, blue, and some are really warm yellow, and it's just this awkward feeling and everything kind of looks bad. We don't want that. So worst case, if you can't get, daylight bulbs, you just want them to be at least the exact same color, because then we can correct that later. But you don't want that color mix in your lighting. And I should also plug again my beloved, for starting photographers, super dirt cheap, probably moral, I wouldn't even say gray area, just a really bad Amazon stuff. You can get little lighting kits that are, frankly, for most applications, quite terrible on Amazon for less than $100. They have wobbly little stands. They usually plug in with just your normal lamp cords. Their functions are on and off, but they'll have a little diffuser with a softbox, which is a type of light modifier. And those things will probably do the trick for you as well. That's probably if you're looking at, I'm in a situation where I desperately need lighting for my picture, I have to buy something, you might be better off buying one of those studio lighting kits than going, to Canadian Tire and getting some sort of lamps, right? Because those ones, although they're not fantastic in terms of photography, they're still going to be more shaped a little bit. The colors of the bulbs should be right. They're going to have diffusers so that you're not getting too hard of a light. Okay. And that being said, I keep saying diffusers. So I was talking about the sun before. The reason why the direct sun, casts such a crazy light, which I don't want to say it's bad, because I also like it. It has its place, but you have to know you're working with it. But the reason it's so hard to work with is because it's really hard light. For anyone who's heard the terms hard and soft light, the sun is an extremely hard light source. And essentially, what makes light hard or soft is the size of it. So what I've always found counterintuitive is that hard light is smaller and soft light is bigger. And when I say bigger or smaller, I hope at least you're thinking, well, the sun is pretty damn big. How could that be hard light then? It's the light source in relation to the object or to the subject. And so the sun is very, 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 very far away. So when we look up, it looks very small, right? And through that distance, it's a very small light source. And that makes it a very hard light source by the time it gets to us. And I guess the confusing thing is so you can make a very hard light source soft by bringing it really close to your subject. But then you obviously have the issue of, if this is a very bright light, that it's going to be too bright. So you have to have something that you can then turn down. Alternatively, you can take something like a hard light source and soften it by, for example, putting clouds in front of it. And that would be called diffusion. The clouds are working as a diffuser, and they're spreading the light and making that light source really big. Okay? So if you're stuck working with a desk light or 2 desk lights, it might be worthwhile if you're having problems with it because it's casting. Oh, and sorry, I guess it should be worth mentioning also one of the inherent traits, like I had a way to show this the other day, which I unfortunately can't do right now, but one of the inherent, oh, actually, no, it was on this handout. You might maybe be able to see it. Not really. The 2 little pictures on the handout, the one on the left, which is the sculpture hanging on the wall, is a much harder light source than the one on the right, which is softer. That's the one on the right is it's a large softbox, which is a big modifier that goes around a flash or a light, very close. And the other one is probably the same softbox, but quite a bit further away, which is what makes it harder. But the inherent trait essentially is if you look at the shadows, the edges on the shadows. So a really soft light will cast either very, very small, faint shadows, or they'll be barely noticeable because the edges of the shadows won't have any contrast. It'll be like a natural gradient that sort of fades away. Whereas if you have a hard contrast in that shadow, that's what you get from a hard light. So if you're casting really like sharp shadows, then your light is probably too hard, basically. So, but going back to why that matters, we have our 2 desk lamps, 45-degree angles, left and right, just like we decided was important. And that light is too hard. It's also possibly too intense. We start moving them back because they don't have control of how much light comes out. And that might get a little bit darker, but nothing's happening with your glare. And it's because of the hard light. And so you can literally take white bed sheets or white t-shirts. I don't know, any sort of translucent, is translucent the one? Yeah. Any sort of translucent material in white, and you can hang that in front, and that's going to soften your light. But ideally, think about this. This is my light. That looks like a light, right? That's my light bulb. If I hang my sheet right here, I don't know if anyone can really see this. I'm sorry if you can. This is not going to do, the light's still coming through in the same places, right? So it's not going to actually do too much. Whereas if I hang my sheet over here, the light's going to hit it like that, and then it's going to spread out even more. This is a very technical drawing, just so you know. But essentially, if I can pull that light source back just a bit, it doesn't have, like, I just don't want it right up against it, right? Because then we are dampening it a little bit, but it's not giving it space to like light up that big white surface, right? So if you look at any lights that go on camera flashes or any modifiers that go on camera flashes, they have different depths, but typically they're about this much. So the flash will be here and the white surface will be here. And it just gives it that space to spread. So just don't like drape it right over top, basically. Also fires and stuff. Oh man, so much fun information. I hope you guys are all hanging on. It's okay. It's okay for me to lose my page like every 5 minutes.
You're doing great, Eric. You got some thumbs up. I don't know if you saw that.
Oh, I am totally in my own world, Garnet. I didn't see anything. Anyway, I just want to find where I was. Whoa, that's a thing that happened. I didn't know that was a thing. Here we are. Okay, so going back to it, because I really got off track and just got into that lighting thing, but that's okay, because it's important for you to know. Oh, actually, this is also a good time to mention when we're talking about lighting and we want it to be bright enough, it's going to be probably really important. This goes along with the tripod, and it will go along with when we talk more about exposure and so on. But you're going to either want some sort of remote for your camera to trigger it without touching it, which again, like some of those cheap smartphone tripods actually come with little Bluetooth remotes, for example. Or, I mean, I would probably for this scenario never go off and buy an extra piece of equipment for it, but just know about and where the timer on your camera is. And cell phones have them, and any camera has a timer. Usually you can set it for 2 or 10 seconds is typical. Some of them you can do like other steps in between. But what I do, and I own multiple remotes to trigger my cameras remotely, and my cameras connect with my cell phone, and I can do that and all these fancy things, and I never do because it's too much hassle, and the fastest and easiest way to do it is to set my camera on a 10-second timer and just hit the button and walk away. And the reason is, if you have a really long shutter speed and you push the camera and it clicks right away, once you've pushed the button on your cell phone or on your camera, even if it's on a tripod, there's going to be a little bit of a vibration. And that vibration is going to cause unsharpness, make your photo unsharp. And so typically, even with a pretty wobbly tripod, typically 10 seconds is going to be enough for that to stop. So, and shockingly, 10 seconds can feel like a really long time when you're waiting for it to take a picture. But if you just set that timer and you hit the button and take your hand away and stop moving, and it also gives you a second, you can also hit the timer and then step out of the way. You know, if you're doing something like using a big living room window and you don't want to cast your shadow, you just hit the timer and slip off to the side and then stop moving so that your floorboards don't shake, and that'll be fine. That's enough. But it's worth mentioning, and that's one of the reasons why I say you need a tripod, because I realize now, after everything we talked about, like, why can't you just hold it in your hands? Well, when you start getting into that lower light situation, or for example, if I had to, like, the light in here is not great, but I could probably take a picture of a painting with it, but it would be super essential that I have a tripod and I have a slow shutter speed. Because even though this looks kind of bright, at least to my eyes right now, the camera doesn't pick it up nearly as bright as my eyes do. And so you're going to need to sort of slow everything down and let more light into your camera, which is going to inherently raise the risk of it shaking. Anyway, so that timer, that remote, that's super important. So just quickly before I go more into that technique stuff, just to finish off my list of sort of essentials, there's one other essential that you absolutely need. I would say the only time you might be able to avoid it is if you're doing 3D works. And even then, I think it's reckless not to have it, is you need editing software. And it's okay. There are lots of different ones, and some of them are quite easy, and there are some free ones. And so I've got a couple listed on this handout, but for just as examples, there's like for a cell phone, there's an app called Snapseed that I know is quite popular for exactly this type of thing because it's completely free. And the functions that you need, when I say you absolutely need something, are crop, which luckily, if you're using your cell phone, you can crop an image directly in your phone these days. But you also want a keystone or perspective correction, which cell phones often don't have. Sometimes they do, not always. And what that means is that when I accidentally, let's try blue, maybe blue's better. What we talked about with the angle, like you can see my whiteboard's on an angle right now. So when I accidentally, blue doesn't work at all. It's not better, not even a little bit. Anyway, when I've accidentally taken my picture like this, and this, I believe, is part of why it's called keystone, because, you know, keystones in an archway, that's what they look like. Other way around, but whatever, you get the point. When I take my picture like this inadvertently, and I need that to be a proper square, what that does, that correction allows me to pull this top part forward and turn it back into a proper square. The only thing that you need to be aware of is that doing that is manipulating the pixels that you've already taken. And so it's sort of pulling and changing your picture. So there is the possibility that you'll get some weird distortion if you do too much of it. And that weird distortion especially happens, can you see this? Yes. If you have a picture that is, I don't even know how to draw this. That is it like that? Kind of. What I'm trying to say is, oh no, here, this is it. If you have a picture that's distorted in two different directions, or that's skewed in two different directions, like it's over an angle, if that makes sense, instead of that like perfectly vertical or perfectly horizontal distortion, that's kind of okay to get rid of afterwards. But if you have it like this, when you start pulling your picture back, it's gonna really mess up and stretch and kind of screw up the look of it. So you want to avoid that. But as I said, if that happens, or even just a little bit, and you need to correct it, you want editing software that has crop and keystoning and perspective corrections. That's really, really important. Another thing is white balance, which is essentially the color correction, and it's how your camera sees white. And this is a little bit complicated because there's a lot that goes along with this. But essentially, I think I'm just going to check my phone camera right now. I know that all DSLR cameras have in their white balance options, they have different functions. There's automatic, where the camera decides for you what white is. And that would typically be what I would recommend. And then there is different preset modes like shade, clouds, incandescent light, fluorescent light, and so on and so forth. And essentially, the color of the light you have, if you look at color, color is all measured in temperature. And so, or color temperature is a thing, I guess. It goes from blue to yellow. And so a cold light source is going to be more blue, and a warm light source is going to be more warm. And the thing is, the color of that light affects the color of the thing in front of us. And typically, if it's just cooler or warmer, the issue is that our eyes are really, really spectacular, and they adjust to it so quickly that we hardly notice, unless there's a drastic change. Like if you walk into a room that has a very white light on, or a really good example is bathrooms that have that, like the vanity lighting that for makeup will always be this like really white blue light so that you can see everything really clearly. And so you'll go into a bathroom and it's this like nice warm light, and then you hit the switch beside the mirror and suddenly you just get blinded by this gross blue. Anyway, so unless we see that like hard change, we often don't notice the difference too much. But the thing is, cameras do. And what that all means concrete is that depending on, like, this is a daylight and it's all right, but depending on the light situation, like this piece of paper could come across more yellow or more blue. So if we have a painting on it, obviously that's going to be an issue, right? And so our cameras do the best they can. This is this automatic white balance. The camera is trying to figure out what in that picture is white. And so if there's a really like blue light, for example, then it's going to get confused about what white is, and it could distort all the colors. Like I'm sure everyone's had this scenario where you've taken a picture and the colors have been completely off of what you've seen. Like they've either been really, really warm or really, really cold, and you've looked at it and thought, why is my picture so orange? It certainly happened a lot in film days. If you would use your flash and you would get your roll of film back, be like, why was this room suddenly orange? It didn't make any sense. And it's because it's just how that like white is being seen. anyway, that all being said, so that's a big thing to get into, and we can even get a little bit more into it. But for now, it's just worth saying you definitely want software where you can adjust the colors. It's really important. And I noticed that, for example, on my phone in the actual camera, it doesn't have specifically an automatic, like it's always on automatic white balance. But all I can actually set is these sort of filters where it changes the colors a little bit. It's called like vivid and warm and cool and whatever. If you have something like that, you're probably best off with automatic, but you're also going to have a scenario where you can go through and change those things, and you'll see a preview of like, what's this picture going to look like. Anyway, the best way to deal with that is by using the white balance tool in editing software. And that can be a difficult task. So it is something unfortunately, it's a really big task. It's not necessarily something we can get into right now. So it's something to look into. If that's an issue that you're having, then look into white balance and white balance cards. So going further on my list of optional essentials, I guess, at the very bottom, I've got a white balance card or a color reference card. And so a white balance card, it's called a gray card. It's a card that is a neutral 18% gray. Gray can be measured in the percent because it's the difference between black and white. So it's an 18% gray, and that is the measuring point that every camera uses to figure out what colors are. So this is a tool that is just a little piece of card, costs almost nothing. It's just gray. And if I hold it in front of my camera and then I go into my editing software later and I say, this color is gray, then the camera knows if that's gray, then this is white and this is black and this is blue and this is green. And so everything balances out. And so that can be a really handy tool to have. And you can just photograph, let's say you're painting with that card just off to the side of it. And then afterwards, all you have to do is find your white balance tool in your software and click on that card with it, and it should fix the colors. So it's something worth having. That being said, I had pretty good results using my my MacBook the other day with that like gray color of my laptop. It actually worked pretty well in a pinch. Ideally, if you're going to buy any sort of photo equipment, a gray card's not going to hurt you. And as I said, it's just usually a piece of cardboard, so they're not expensive. But that's going to be really important for your color management. So I'm going to try to actually go through this a little bit faster now, just so that we can get to a point where we can talk about some things. But other things, like we talked a little bit about off-camera flash and lights, light modifiers. Oh no, I already got through all that stuff. That's fantastic. Okay, moving on. And we even talked about lenses, sort of. So, one thing I didn't mention with lighting is, again, when we're using artificial lighting, or if you have a flash, or if you're having an issue with that light causing glare, try different things. So the 45-degree angle is like the standard, but it doesn't always work for whatever reason. Sometimes I find that 45-degree angle will still cause glare. Things that work really well, though, are like basically all you want is for your whole space to be much brighter, right? So you can be pointing your lights at reflective surfaces. So I'm lucky enough here to have all like proper white walls and a white ceiling. And so I can take my lights and put them right up close to the white wall, and that'll make the whole room brighter. Or I can shine them at the ceiling and it'll spread more light around. Another thing that I can do is take something like this. This is just a piece of white foam core from the craft section at the dollar store. And can you see it? There it is. And with that, I can reflect the light, whatever light I'm using. So what I can do is fill in shadows. For example, a great use of it would be if you are photographing a painting laying on the floor in front of a door or in a doorway. There's sometimes a possibility, depending on how the light's coming in and where you can position it, that it's going to get a little bit dark at the bottom. And sometimes I'll just hold this up at the bottom and it'll reflect the light back in and get rid of that shadow. With portraiture, you'll often put it like sort of beneath someone's face to fill any harsh shadows, stuff like that. So it's a really great method to just manipulate the light and move it to where you need it to be by just using a piece of something white, right, that can reflect the light. By the same regard, I also always have chunks of black. And so, for example, when we were practicing photographing sculptures and using smartphones, especially, and the smartphones wanted to brighten everything up, this was really great to sort of mold and give things a bit more depth by moving the black in, and it would stop light from coming in. And so it can sort of sculpt and mold something a little bit more. So in the sense, or in the vein of being all over the place right now, when we talked about flat lighting, when it comes to sculptures, you often don't want your lighting to be flat because that takes out the three-dimensionality of it. And so having a little bit more of a shaped light will give the feeling of the three-dimensionality. So what I often want to do is add in a little bit of shadow, but I want it controlled. I don't just want there not to be any light on one side, because then it could fall completely off into black and you can't see the details of what you're trying to photograph. But I can add in something like this to just darken it up a little bit and to give it a bit more shape. All right, I probably wanted to talk about something else, but I'm not going to because I don't know what that was. So getting into the technique, I'll start with 2D. Actually, so let's start with this really quickly with the camera settings. Ideally, you want to be controlling everything in your camera. When it comes to scenarios like this, you don't actually really want automatic settings taking over, because the camera, as smart as that little computer is, doesn't know exactly what you're trying to do. And so as I've experienced, like you'll have something, it's a relatively dark space, and the camera thinks, oh God, we can't take the picture that dark, and starts pushing everything brighter, but we actually want it to stay dark. So that's a problem. So most phones, not all, have some sort of pro mode, they will call it. I know that some Apple phones have the pro mode. Mine certainly does not. But all phones will have some sort of exposure correction. It's usually like a circle with a plus and a minus in it. And that's where you can basically say, okay, take your automatic picture, but make it 50% darker or brighter, right? But if you have one of those pro modes, or if you have a proper camera, you have three main settings, and I do have to do this. This is what we wanted the whiteboard for the other day. Didn't have it, so I really hope you can see this. You have three main settings on your camera to get a perfectly exposed picture. And anybody who spent time, even maybe did a photography class in the probably 2000s, where you were working with film and fully manual old cameras, anyone who's done that knows these cameras all had three settings, essentially. One of them was the ISO, which is how sensitive your film was to light. So this, is that backwards? Oh, it is the way that I'm seeing it. That's funny. So the ISO, when you were talking about film, was actually the sensitivity of the film you bought. It wasn't a setting you had, but you would put a 400 ISO film in your camera, and that's how sensitive your film was. Now we're lucky and we can do that digitally, so I can set the ISO in my camera. So the next thing you have is the shutter speed, which is basically, the shutter is a little door. Think of it like blinds on a window or something. and the amount of time they're open, they're letting light in the whole time, and then you close them again, and then they stop letting light in. And that light gets onto this however sensitive sensor. And the shutter speed is how long that light comes into the camera for. And that's actually usually measured in a fraction. So typically it will be measured as, let's say, 1/160th of a second. And that's when you're working with mechanical shutters, with actual cameras with moving parts, that's the actual amount of time that shutter is open for will be 1/160th of a second, or 1/50th of a second, or 1 second, which we actually come into in this world of trying to get as much light in as possible. But that's very, very slow. And that's where the tripod comes in, because you can't hold that in your hand. 1 second is a really long time to hold still for. So the third part of our little fun triangle is the aperture, which is denoted with an F, or often it will be written as an A on your camera or whatever, but if you hear people talk about an f-stop, that's the aperture. And the size of the aperture is basically, it's a circle, a ring that manually opens, and it controls how much light comes into your camera. And I guess the complicated thing, I'm never good at explaining this, is when you talk about an aperture, the bigger the number, the smaller the actual aperture on the camera, and the less light that's coming in. So an f8 or an f16 aperture lets in less light than an f2. That lets in a whole bunch more. And I guess the way that you can see it is an aperture that's 1 means 1:1, the exact size of like the back of the camera or the lens basically is as big as the front. So it's letting light directly straight through, and it's not getting funneled into anything. It's basically like a straight shot through the lens. And so that's a 1. And so the higher that number goes, the smaller the aperture. Anyway, this is all important because now we have our 3 main factors in defining exposure. So right here, this X is our perfect exposure. And to get there, we need a perfect balance in that situation between the ISO, the shutter speed, and the f-stop. But this is where it gets super complicated. Everything has its pros and cons. So the higher number the ISO, the way that works is the more light sensitive it is. So if these are all of our pixels, they're really far apart right now. And so the light can come at them from all different angles, and it lets more light in. I realize this is hard to see, I'm sorry. It makes the sensor more light sensitive, but what happens then is that you get this like graininess in your pictures. And so anyone who remembers film, a high ISO film, you could take pictures at night on vacation or at a party or whatever, but they were really grainy. They kind of looked like they had a layer of TV fuzz static on top of them. Whereas a lower ISO, it pushes everything together and you get a much finer feeling, a much finer picture, but it is a lot less light sensitive. So this is really important because we're trying to get our perfect exposure, and this is all a bit of a balancing act. So the thing is, ISO has serious detrimental effects on the image. And so we always start with that as low as we can. So let's say 100. So if you have a setting, if you can set it on your phone or on your camera, 100, 160, 200, sort of that area is where you want to start. Then, and this is not for all photography, but specifically for artwork, what we want to do is be photographing it probably around an f8 or f11 aperture, which is relatively small. We used to have a saying that doesn't rhyme. I don't know how to say it. But like if the sun's out, you use an f8. Basically, it was like a rule of thumb of on a sunny day, you would always use an f8. But as I said, everything has its up and down. And so the wider or the smaller the aperture, the more focal distance you get, so everything is sharp from front to back of the picture, which is actually not a negative, but less light comes in. When you open the aperture up more light floods in, but then your depth of field, so how far the sharpness and the focus in the picture goes from the main subject, gets shortened. So when you've seen a picture of someone and right behind them, everything in the background is blurry, that's always going to be an open aperture or a low f-stop, right? And so just like with the ISO, to make it more light sensitive, you have to give up the image quality. With the f-stop, to make it, to bring more light in, you also have to get rid of some of that focus, which is typically fine, but you know, we're talking about areas where the tip of someone's nose could be in focus and their eye could be out of focus. And so especially if you're photographing a sculpture, it could be like the front, if you're using a wide aperture and the front of the sculpture is in focus and the back is not. Or if you have oil paintings or acrylics with these like thick peaks, you could accidentally focus on one of the peaks and have the actual painting be slightly out of focus, right? So that's why we want to use ideally like an f8 for that as a starting point. And so that leaves us with shutter speed. So pros and cons. The shutter speed is how long the light comes into the camera for, but it does that by opening this shutter, and your camera has to be perfectly still in the time that that's open. And so you slow down your shutter speed, you get lots of light, but if there's the tiniest shake, you have a blurry picture. And so that's what happens on your phone when you take a picture at night, and you take one picture like of the Christmas lights, I don't know, and it flashes and you think, oh, that looks terrible. So you turn off the flash. And then you take another picture and you think, oh, this is going to look good. And then suddenly it sort of everything blinks out for a second and the picture comes up and it's super blurry. And it's because your phone slowed down the shutter speed to be able to get enough light without the flash. And through that, you were shaky. But this is still our best alternative when we're photographing art. So that is another reason why the tripod is so important. Because if I don't have this on a tripod, I'm very limited in how long I can expose that picture for. But as soon as I put it on a tripod and I'm not touching it anymore, I can easily expose it for 20 or 30 seconds if I need to, if I just need light coming in from everywhere, right? So that was so much that my head hurts after it. But the thing is, it's super important because this is how we get light into our camera, right? And so we always have to think about this too, because it's always that balancing act, like where, you know, I might be able to open my aperture more if I'm taking a picture of something completely flat on a flat plane, whereas if it's something with a lot of depth, I can't. And those are things that you need to know. Or if I have a picture where everything's white, I might actually be able to get away with a bit of a higher ISO because that extra noise is more noticeable in black. But you always have to be cognizant of that and really trying it out. Anyway, so now that we're there and we've done that, we're taking our picture of a 2D painting, and really key here for the best quality is that we set up our tripod so that I'll do it here. We obviously need the whole painting in the picture, right? So this is too close. So I ideally want my camera sort of this far, this far away. So I'm filling up as much of the frame as I can with my picture. Obviously without cutting any of it off. And the thing is, when you later go and crop your picture, so people talk about megapixels and so on and so forth, the pixels are essentially what's holding the information of your picture. And so if you cut it off, you have less information in your picture. So if I take my picture from really far away and crop around it, I'm only taking this tiny little bit. So I have the best cell phone camera that you can buy because it has 17 billion pixels. I don't know what they're at right now. This amazing camera, and then I take a picture from really far away, and then I start cutting down the edges, and essentially what I'm left with is the quality of the picture I would have taken with my phone camera 10 years ago, because I've taken away all of that extra information. So we want to fill the frame as much as we can always. Again, when it comes to 3D sculptures and such, keep in mind the stylistic and the creative aspect of it. But especially when it comes to 2D, we want to fill the frame. So we've set up our painting. It's completely flat. We've filled the frame. We've got flat lighting. We're on a tripod. We've got everything set up. I think that's it. All we have to do now is make sure, and this is an odd thing to have to say, but people forget this all the time. Don't forget to focus your camera, especially if you're using a cell phone. It's really easy to be unfocused somewhere else. Again, if you're using a cell phone, the focus is often tied in with the exposure control, like the brightness. So you're going to want to be tapping anyway. But yeah, wow, that's it. That's my whole technique spiel. Okay, so that was very anticlimactic because I thought I had something else to say, but apparently I've been talking for too long. So let me just go through one more time quickly here and make sure that I haven't missed out on any of my like super key points. It doesn't really look like I did. Perfect. So what we can get into for the last half hour is just talking about some other things, answering some questions and so on. What I would really like to mention though is, as much as this kind of is like a dialed in technique and a science, it also isn't. It's also an art. So play with it. As I said, if you are doing reproductions, it is extremely prescriptive. This is how you do it, pretty much, and that's it. You have a bit of leeway in, techniques to get your light in there because you obviously want that, but you want the same result every time. So all you're trying to do is eliminate, basically, you have the technique and then you're problem solving after that. Especially though when it comes to sculptures and things like that, or if you want to show off your work in a different way, playing with it is the best way to learn this. And it's still the same thing that I do every time. The difference is I have a lot of different knowledge from and experience from doing this a lot. So I know what things are more likely to work. But if I'm having trouble with a painting or a sculpture or any picture, I basically start at the top of my list of like, okay, what would be the next best thing? And I just start working my way through until I find something that works. Don't be afraid to just keep trying and try different things. And sometimes, this is also really worth mentioning, sometimes you have to reset. Sometimes you start screwing around so much that you lose the point and you don't know where you started anymore. And in those moments, it can be really helpful to just bring it right back to the beginning and basically start again, just scrap it and reset it. Another thing is every single bit of knowledge about photography that exists in this universe is super easily accessible on the internet. So honestly, if you get stuck with something, the more specific you can make your Google search about it, the better. Like with these tools, I'm hoping that, you're having issues with glare. You can't figure it out. You can literally type in like how to photograph my painting with less glare or whatever using office lights and blah, 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 and you'll get that information. So keep that in mind. Like just go out and search for it. The information is there. So if you really get into trouble with something, don't hesitate to pull out your phone or computer and Google it. And one last troubleshooting point, because the question came up and I realized that we never turned back around to it and we never got back into it. Someone asked me on Saturday about photographing images behind glass, paintings behind glass. So my number one answer is don't. If you can avoid it, don't do it. Number two is if you have to, you're gonna struggle with lighting. But you're still going to start at your 45-degree angles and you're going to try to make that work. Ideally, you're not going to use external lighting, you'd use natural lighting. But one issue that you're going to run into is having a reflection from the camera. And one possibility, we talked about this before for someone who was photographing stuff on white and kept getting a reflection in their jewelry from the camera lens. Different things. So if I'm photographing something that's very shiny and bright, then I will put something white around my camera, like white paper, cardstock, Bristol board or something, and cut a hole and put my camera lens through that hole. And I'm probably going to have to edit the camera lens out, but everything else in the reflection will disappear. And the thing that works really well for glass is to use black paper, like black construction paper or cardstock, and literally put your camera lens through it, because the black is not going to reflect things, right? And you'll still be able to see through that black reflection. And so putting that black surface around your camera will get rid of the reflection of like you and your camera and your, like, you might just have the lens, but that's easier to deal with than your tripod and stuff like that, right? Okay, so moving on into it, Garnet, you're going to have to start helping me out here now.
Need to share your screen?
I'll do that in a minute.
Okay.
I just saw, oh, okay. I just saw that somebody just asked one question.
Oh yeah, we've got a question there.
The optimal focal length, there's not like, sorry, the question is, what would you say is the optimal focal length? There's not, there's a pretty wide range, but essentially if you're somewhere between like 50 millimeters and 80 millimeters, then you're going to be pretty perfect. So this also gets complicated because it comes down to sensor size, how focal length works. So when we talk about focal length in cameras, and when you see focal length advertised on a lens or something, that number is actually always typically being based off of 35 millimeter film, because when all of this stuff started happening, that's what the standard was. So 50 millimeters, a 50 millimeter focal length or lens on a 35 millimeter film camera is approximately what our eyes see. It's like the field of view that we see when you're looking forwards. And so 50 millimeters are great because you typically don't have any sort of distortion, and you can see exactly what you as the viewer can see. That being said, that's a sensor that's 35 millimeters, which means 35 by 24, which means a lot of cameras that some of you might have they'll often be called crop sensor cameras or APS-C cameras. And those are typically half or 1.5 or like a little bit, 75% of the size of a 35 millimeter. And so of like film, sorry. And so that size of the sensor changes the field of view. So then on a crop sensor, you're approximately at 35 millimeters is sort of your human eye. Whereas if you use a medium format camera, which is bigger than a typical 35 millimeter film, then it's 80 millimeters is your normal human eye. So it depends on what type of technology you're using. So that being said, a cell phone, I can't tell you because every cell phone has a different size image sensor, but it's going to be a huge difference. So instead of it being 35 as your like normal view, it's going to be like 10 millimeters maybe is your normal field of view. So basically take it all with a grain of salt, but typically like 50 millimeters is a great place to start with your focal length.
See, we've got another question in the chat there, Eric. Are you seeing that?
Yeah, I am. Do you want to just read that out though, and then?
I'm wondering if you need to take a picture of 2 and 3D, like body painting art. Is it better to treat the art and light as a portrait or 2D, or on the 2D?
That's
just take the ensemble or full 3D. My question is hard to formulate. Sorry.
That is hard to formulate because it's difficult, but essentially if it's something like body painting, you're not just I think that comes back to what you want to show off, right? And if you just wanted to show off your painting skills, you may not have done it on a body. So the reason you're typically going to my assumption is that you're working with the curvature and the contours of the body when you're doing your painting. And so in that regard, I would treat it like a 3D type of thing and just ensure that all of the important bits, because again, when I'm talking about this like 2D treatment, it's really for, reproduction purposes, like having it be the exact same for prints, right? And so if you're just showing off the work, then I would treat it more, anything where you're just showing it off, you can treat it more like a 3D living dimensional thing. And so the key elements for me there would be, first off, you're going to want to see those contours, right? And then the next thing is that you just want to make sure that any of the like key points are bright enough that you can see the details in them. So you might not want to use like super hard shadows on it because you're going to lose details. Anywhere that curve, a shoulder blade or anything, anywhere that curves away from the light, you're going to really lose the shadows. So you are going to want a bit of a uniform light, but you can still play with it more for sure. Does that answer? Okay. Great. Anyone else who has questions, go for it. And in the meantime, I'm actually going to start screen sharing, and then I'll start talking about some other stuff. And so, Garnet, when I'm doing this, I can't see the chat right now.
Okay.
So just go for it if there's any questions. So Garnet asked me to talk a little bit about troubleshooting type of stuff. And the first thing that I thought about was this image. Can everyone see that? Did this work?
It hasn't opened on the full screen. I think what you might need to do is unshare, open it, and then share again. I've encountered
That's really
this
frustrating. Yeah, I don't want that. Yeah, you're right. That's going to be really annoying, but it's okay. So this image.
Yes, great.
And so we had talked about this before too. It's like, these are really beautiful, brilliant watercolors. And then the lovely artist really likes to work with gold leaf, which is just awful as a photographer. Because as you can see, we have those deep blacks. We also have whites. And then we have a super, super reflective surface. And gold leaf is real fun too, because it's not just very reflective, but since it's not actually, like, it is slightly textured, so it's picking up the light from different angles. So the way it is, you can already see, I'm sure everyone can use the power of their imagination and realize that this gold was the same all around in the real thing, in real life. But if you look, the bottom right corner is darker than the top right corner in this image. And you can sort of see that gradient. And that was a choice that we made. I'm not going to lie, there was a significant amount of struggle to get there. But the choice that we then made was basically that way it showed off that it's this dynamic thing. Because what we found is that the gold, even when you got it sort of seemingly perfectly, it showed up in really interesting ways on the picture. And so this way it was a very light gradient. And the artist liked this. So I do a lot of this stuff. I do it with the artist directly so that when it comes down to something like this, they can decide if that's what they want. But this picture, we decided on that because that gradient sort of really shows you the texture and how that gold functions. Because if you were in front of the painting, and now this is for a print, right? But if you were in front of the painting, everywhere you would move your body, you would see the gold shining differently. And so that was a really unique challenge because we had to figure out a way to show that off, show how that gold shines and shimmers, but also have it be clear and visible and true to the painting. So I actually found a different one. Oh my Lord, I'll get there. Now it's just technical problems. So I actually found these two pictures. Same image. I need to stop sharing this one. Okay. Oh, that's the wrong. Sorry. Okay, so this is the same image, and I was going through my pictures today, and I thought this was really great because it would actually show you folks the process a little bit. So I believe this is more or less, this was very close to what we went to in the end, what we went with. But you can see in this picture how the different light positions were really affected that gold. And how when we got it wrong, the background would get really sort of dark and muddy, but we would still have that gold really exploding. And also here down at the bottom, that's a piece of this foam core trying to use it to bounce light in from the bottom to balance everything out a bit. And in the end, as you can tell, it didn't actually work. And this turned out a little bit better. But again, here, this is not the picture we used. It was just the closer result. And what I was saying just now about the gold, like really showing off that glimmer, here we got it pretty flat without too much shine, but it also kind of then disappears into the mountains. Like it doesn't feel right. So a lot of this stuff, as I was saying before, this is that playing around and really just trying different angles for the lighting. You can tell very much here, the top left has more light coming down from it than the bottom right. So I definitely did not have that like clean left and right 45-degree angle. I can't remember the exact angles that I ended up with, but there was a lot of moving lights around and back and forth. And this is also a great example of the white balance. So I believe in this picture, I did the white balance afterwards. I had a reference card in a different picture. And so in this specific one where it's so blue, that was because we were using natural light coming through the window. It often comes out pretty blue, and I had to correct that after to get that closer, warmer look. So, trying to find more things. I just went through archives today and tried to pull out things that sort of showed the process, but it's really tough because I don't typically take pictures of the actual process. Getting creative and holding things. Actually, I can do it this way maybe. So talking about holding things, specifically how to, hold sculptures and so on. Oh, sorry, I'm just about there. I just getting this stuff in here. Okay. All right, I've got it figured out. I know what I'm doing. This is figured out. Open multiple. Okay, so I hope that's what you're seeing. So this was an interesting challenge when it comes to 3D pieces, and somebody came in with this beautiful fur backpack, and we tried multiple different things and did not know how to deal with it. And in the end, we decided to have Garnet model this piece and wear it on her back because we had taken, I think we did in the end have a couple pictures where it was sitting on a table, but this is a backpack and it's meant to be worn. And so it was just the decision then between myself and the artist who made this piece that we were going to add a person into the image. And so I think these things are really important to see when we're talking about especially 3D works and like that creativity that you can bring into it. So similarly, if you go to page 6, the last page of the handout that you were sent, there's a picture of a sculpture, a wooden carving with a hand holding it. And that was also essentially a creative decision because what we found was looking at it sitting down on a table, the picture didn't feel quite right. And it really didn't show off the sculpture or the rattle the way that we wanted it to. And it being a rattle, it's something that would be held in a hand. And so we had the artist hold it. And made the choice to then hold it in his hand and take a picture of his hand as well. And so that's a similar thing with this backpack where really it just comes down to like, this was, there's the setup, there's the system, this is what we're doing. We're putting the pieces here, we're holding them up. We're usually using plexiglass or something to hold them higher so that you can see them. And it just all didn't work out with these pieces. And so we made the decision to then add in a different element and just get creative with it. And as I said, when it comes to 3D pieces, you can really do what you want with them as long as it's showing off the piece the way that you need it to. So that the jury can see it for a prize, or so that a potential buyer can see it and see what it would look like. Like, as long as you're showing that off, then it's all fair game. I really quickly want to show this. I won't really talk about it, but what I was saying about the glass thing, if you are stuck having to photograph something behind glass, this is quite literally just a piece of black construction paper with a hole cut in it so that it goes around the lens. So here I'm going to go through a couple different things. A lot of this stuff where basically, yeah, it's hard to show the mistakes and the difficulties because I didn't photograph the process, or the solutions, I guess, because I didn't photograph the process. But I think it's worth talking about the thought process that goes into a lot of this. And so this specific thing, the artist is really cares about the paper that they're using and is always looking for different papers that really bring out the work and the painting. And so they were really asking if we could take pictures that showed the texture on the paper. And that was more of a challenge than I thought it would be, because the first try, and I'll explain this quickly, was this. And this is sort of photographed lighting wise would be the classic way of showing a texture, which is you light it from one side, more or less, or on an angle, so that parts of those bumps are getting cast into shadow. And that brings out the texture. So something like this, a textured paper like this, if you photograph it completely flat on, even if you get the image on it to come out the way you want, the paper is going to look like a piece of printer paper. Or if you did the like 45 degrees, perfectly 45-degree light left and right, if you get that perfect, then it's going to look like it's drawn on a piece of printer paper, because all that texture is going to disappear through that flat lighting. So in this scenario, you need a bit more of a dynamic lighting. Now, we found collectively that this didn't work that well, because what you can clearly see is that the actual painting is sort of going under. And now the bumps and ripples on the paper are really the thing that you're paying attention to. And so there was a lot of playing around. And what you can see here is that obviously the angle, like the angles were changed, but it was still that dynamic lighting to bring out the bumps and cast that little bit of shadow, but just a little bit less. So in this image, I do know the first one here, I only had one light coming sort of from the top on an angle down, or sorry, from the side top-ish, probably like 45 degrees from above. And that's how I got this result, and that was too much. And so here I just added in another one, but sort of on the other side, but less intense, to fill out those shadows a little bit, and it made the actual painting pop out more. So moving on, here was an interesting thing because that I wanted to show, because talking about aperture, the f-stop, and that depth of field, and like how much focus is in range. So with this, it was interesting because we had a session, it was 45 minutes. We had one piece to photograph. It went pretty quickly. And so I wanted to have different angles. As I said, with sculptures, it can be really nice to have different angles as well, so you can see the whole thing. Think about if your work's being shown on a plinth in the middle of a gallery, people are going to see it from all sides. And so I played around with it. And here I used targeted depth of field to try to make the head pop out a little bit more. Seeing this now, I find that because of this red line on it, it actually doesn't work that well, because it still pulls your attention to that red line a bit. But it was definitely a good attempt. And here you can see that the head is all completely in focus, and the focus falls off really quickly. And that's not that it's out of focus, that's that I was using a wide aperture for it. So I had a thing to talk about with this one, but I can't remember now. And it's just, that worked out. Everything was fine. Oh, it was just about the lighting angle again with the sculptures being different. This is more lit from sort of the top right coming down, as you can tell, the back part. So the lighting was more over here, if you can still see that cursor. So it's shining down really on the back, and then this part's all getting a bit of fall off, but it's casting here into shadow, right? And it's casting the shadow in that direction. So it's not quite like here over the butt of the horse. It's closer, it's more towards me, towards the camera. But I can't show you that on a flat screen. So that kind of angle. This is essential. this is something that's really important to see. We want our images to be as flawless as possible as an image. Anything that is in the piece of art that you've made can stay in the image. Anything that's external shouldn't be there. You don't want dust on a necklace or a pair of earrings. You don't want fuzz and fluff on your felted hat or on anything. And what I found is people who work with wool and people who work with leather or suede hides, especially, get all of these like little particles everywhere. And it's really important to get that stuff off because it's distracting in pictures. And so right now we're using, I believe that's tape, or maybe I'm wrong and this is not what's happening, but it's definitely what I think is happening that was important enough to talk about it. But
it's just painter's tape, Eric.
Yeah, so it is. It's blue. Isn't painter's tape usually green? You're confusing.
It's a really gentle kind of painter's tape that we use. And then in my other hand, there's a glove that I'm just using so that I'm not handling the piece.
Perfect. So that's it. So usually masking tape, painter's tape, something like that, to just take off all the little pieces of fluff. You can also do it in post-production if you have proper editing software. It's really easy, but I always think what we can get done before we take the picture saves us more work and effort later. And so anything that doesn't belong, get rid of it. And the attention to details really, really matters in this stuff. And that will set your pictures apart from others, is how much you pay attention to these details. Just other little challenges. So mix of 2D and 3D, essentially a sculpture on a canvas or a three-dimensional piece like this. It's the same thing again, because you can't, if you use that flat lighting, that 45-degree angle lighting from both sides, you're going to flatten it out and it's going to look more like a painting. And you're not going to be able to tell that this is actually stuff glued onto something, right? And so that's where it becomes important to play with that lighting and play with shadows. So the shadows in here are what essentially brings it to life and gives it the depth so that you can see, because you're photographing something that from the front, it's completely flat, right? So to be able to see that depth, you really need to play with that lighting. And going back to like talking a lot about natural light and window light, you can do this too with a window light, literally holding, like, instead of having your piece be flat to the window where we get that flat front on light, you can have it to the side so that the light hits it and falls off in shadow. So it's all still transferable. This is my real troubleshooting bit. So this was an amazing, beautiful sculpture that I loved when I saw and hated at the same time, because it is painted, which is great and fine, but it's covered in glitter and gemstones and rhinestones, and then it's lacquered with a clear lac that just really, it's just very glossy. It just brings out that shine, and that was the artist's whole point. But then we had to put up artificial lights and photograph it. And so the reason why I wanted to show exactly this picture is sort of the different stages and talking about playing around. And so as you can tell, the interesting thing was, because of the structure with this, depending on where the light was, we have completely different features that are coming out and completely different prominent bits. So this is I believe this was the finished one, the final result that I went with and that we edited and everything. And the way that this was, it was near to impossible also to edit out any of the glare. So it came down to making that decision as we're photographing it, like moving the lighting and moving and moving and moving and bouncing it off the ceiling and bouncing it off the wall and putting the piece in front of the window and changing everything and just trying to get essentially the least glare possible. Glare in a way that it doesn't bother you and that it doesn't take away from the picture. And so that's what we came out with in the end. But this was a painstaking process. I think we worked for about an hour just bouncing light in different ways and trying different things and trying to find that perfect look, because as you can tell, it's a completely different picture each time. anyway, that was all that I had prepared to show you, unless I have a couple diagrams and things like that, but I don't think that they're gonna do a ton. I think, even though our time's pretty much up, if anyone has any questions, please, now would be a really good time for it. Before
Thank
we're
you
done.
so much, Eric. I know we presented you with a huge challenge of encapsulating all of that into 2 hours. So thank you.
Been fun. It's been exciting. 2 hours and on a screen where we can't actually tangibly do the things. But yeah, any last questions? I hope that folks have gotten a bit of this, that some of it makes sense. It was a lot of information for a very short time, and I'm scattered, but that's just who I am. So
Oh, sorry, was somebody asking a question?
I thought maybe Jen had a question. Jen, no?
I just wanted to acknowledge, as Eric said, you know, I hope you're feeling like you have a better understanding of what's involved in taking photographs of your art. Our goal tonight was to give you an overview and some tools to go and use some materials and cameras that you have available, and to try taking your own pictures and see how that goes. But I absolutely want to acknowledge that this is a profession, right? I mean, people study this for years and troubleshoot for years, and it takes a lot of learning. But I think it's really great for you to be able to take pictures on your own when you need to. And when you have the opportunity, there are professional photographers like Eric, you know, especially if you're building a mountainscape with glitter and varnish,
cool.
and you need to get something really challenging photo. I'm rounding up all this business for you of the most challenging works. Thank me later.
it's okay. I love it. That was so much fun.
But yeah, there are people in this community that do this for a living that can help you with those photos too. So I think it's always striking a balance, but I think this is particularly important, you know, if you're working on a deadline and you really need to get these photos done yourself. And the other piece that I think often is difficult for people to remember in the excitement of creating is taking photos of your process and taking photos of work along the way as you're making it. So I hope that this will help you with all of those things.
Awesome.
Don't see any other questions in the chat. So before we wrap, I also just wanted to mention that I hope you've heard that the call for submissions to the Yukon Permanent Art Collection is open. The deadline is January 31st. So if you're considering applying, feel free to contact me or my staff if you have questions. We're here to help with applications, and we'll be doing free photography sessions with Eric again in January. We usually time those about a week and a half before the deadline, because we know that people often are working on their art right up until the deadline. So we do have those sessions available in Whitehorse and Dawson. And I hope that if you're considering applying, or if you know somebody who is, that you'll let them know so you can take advantage of those. We'll be advertising them shortly. Okay. Well, thanks for joining us tonight, everyone. I hope this was helpful, and I hope that we'll hear from you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Bye.